Today we are going to start looking at alternative regimes. So what did we do? We started with democracy. We learned about its attributes, how the core activity that defines a democracy is election, which allows for the preferences of individuals to be transformed into policy making, either directly by choice of policy or indirectly through delegation, where citizens elect representatives and representatives select the policies. So we saw different types of democracies. And we saw some of the consequences of these different types. The proportional representation versus majority rule as to how it might affect the different aspects of the governance and even the kind of economic policies that might emerge. But when we look around us in terms of the type of regimes that are functioning as political regimes, we see that the standard model of democracy is only one type of political system. There are many different types. In the other extreme, we have the authoritarian vision, correct? In which the vote or preference of citizens is not important for policy making. Political power is concentrated in the hands of one person or a very small group of people. But between that extreme of authoritarian regimes and the standard democratic model that you observe in the United States or in Western Europe, you have many different types of political regimes in which some aspects of democracy are practiced and some aspects are ignored. So for us to understand the governance and how government functions and how policies are made, it is important to understand the characteristics of these regimes that are in between democracy and authoritarian regimes. So the article that I asked you to read is an overview of research on this issue of what we call the hybrid regimes, but an overview of research that has been done by German scholars. So that in a sense, on this issue, there have been many studies in the United States, all over the world, but this one also gives you a flavor of how Germans, given their own unique history of economic and political science, are looking at this issue. Nevertheless, I think the value of this article is that it creates a theoretical framework, because it's easy to simply look at different political regimes and say, here is what I see here, what I see here. Let's put them in different categories. But this article says, let's see if we can develop some conceptual framework and then put these different types of regimes that we observe into these categories. It also makes a very interesting observation that I think you need to keep in mind. The observation is that when we look at other types of political regimes, sometimes we feel like these are transitional, so that the history is moving in the direction of democracy. Therefore, the political regimes, no matter where you start, from monarchy, dictatorship, gradually they are going to go through reform, revolution, and end up becoming democracies. This was a dominant perception for a while. There were periods of optimism. For example, after World War II, there was this belief that gradually all countries would see the benefit of democracy and the benefit of capitalism, and then we are going to transition to democratic capitalism. This did not happen. There was another wave of democratization after colonial rule came to end, and there was an expectation that these countries will gradually move toward democracy after they develop economically. Some of them did, some did not happen. In Latin America, for example, we had this transition to democracy in many countries. And then there was a third wave of movement toward democracy. That was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. All of these Eastern European countries that were forced into the communist camp after World War II were suddenly liberated. Russia itself was no longer a communist dictatorship. So there was this rush towards adopting democratic institutions, especially elections. Now when you look at their constitutions, they are all, the formal political system, the formal constitution is democratic. Elections, freedom of the press, basic civil rights. But when we look at them, we see that on some dimensions of what we call ideal characteristics of democracy, many countries around the world have not fully achieved those ideals. Yet they are forms of democracy. And the authors of this article call them defective democracies. So that's one of the names that you see here in terms of names for various types of political regimes. Nevertheless, we no longer believe that they are in temporary transition. Some of these types of governments, which are half democratic, seem to be quite stable. At least there is enough political power in the hands of those who are maintaining the system, the ruling elite, to keep them going. And we don't see signs of transition. It can happen suddenly, political change, future is uncertain. But for now, these are stable regime times, therefore it is worthwhile to understand them, because they're going to be around for decades to come. Okay, so this is what the article tries to do, is to come up with a concept for how to put different countries in different categories of regime types. What is a good way of identifying political regime types, and then how do you put each country in? So they come up with some kind of metric, a way of measuring them. So let's see what they have done. First of all, does anyone like to, if you had a chance to read the article, does anyone have any comment, observation? Would you like to share? All right, so maybe along the way you would have some ideas. Okay, so what they say, first of all, is that they propose these names for the spectrum of different regime types, just broad names, of course. There are many ways that countries have been categorized. Functioning democracy, defective democracy, electoral authoritarianism, where you have elections, but the ruling elite can control the outcome and screen the candidates. So it's authoritarian, but they have regular elections. And then closed authoritarianism without bothering with elections, and totalitarianism, which is an ideological dictatorship in which the government dictates lifestyle, it dictates ideology, it dictates the economic and political system. That's why it's called totalitarianism. Very extreme dominance of the society by the government on behalf of a ruling ideological group in the society. So it says, in order to understand these regimes, let's go into two extremes. One of them is functioning democracies, and the other one is a political system that's fully authoritarian. And then we start understanding the attributes of these two extreme systems. We start from both sides coming to this middle, where most of the real political systems are functioning on a day-to-day basis. That's why the article points to a type of analysis called double root, because of the fact that you have one pole as democracies, one pole as full dictatorships or non-democracies. And we then say, here are the attributes of each type, and we start coming to the center and saying, if we choose a country, it has attributes A, B, C from democracy, attributes X, Y, Z from dictatorship. Which category does it belong to? Okay, so, and then to really study those attributes, they come up with 5 broad functions or characteristics. Whether the system has elections, what are the level of political participation, what is the status of the media, civil rights, whether within government there is division of power and horizontal accountability among split powers within a government, and how effective is government in its ability to deliver goods and services and implement laws and regulations in society. Okay, so in order to do that, they say, let's look at what is ideal about democracy. Okay. And they say there are 3 attributes that make democracy variable. Freedom, the fact that citizens are free and they are collectively in charge of society rather than something that's not accountable to the citizens. Some entity is in charge and dominates the society. Equality in political opportunities and political behavior. Same rights for every citizen without anyone having less than others. And control, meaning that once we give political power to a policymaker, even when it's an elected person, after election we still have political control over that person throughout the time that he has the responsibility, and then at the end of some period again we have the right to either re-elect or remove that person and elect another person. That's the concept of control. So certain basic freedoms that are not subject to even majority rule, they are guaranteed as basic rights at the individual level. No one can touch them. And those rights, whatever they are, should be equal among citizens. And the society as a group continuously has control over political power. So that absolute power or a strong power does not lead to abuse by those who have that power in their hands. So these are the ideal criteria. And then they say, let's look at the pillars or the poles of a functioning political system. Okay, so and then see how each one of these activities or components of a political system allow the society to achieve these 3 goals. So you have the goals, and then you have the institutions of the society. So, how are decisions made? Obviously, a sign of democracy is that the dominant mechanism for making decisions is election. Both election of policymakers and then deciding on policy again through voting and election among the delegated appointed political officials. Along with that, you want the regulation and the good functioning of what we call intermediate space. Why intermediate? Because citizens are, all of us are citizens, but there are millions of us. But in order to exert our political influence on policymakers, we have other institutions. We have political parties, so that those who have shared ideology can organize themselves and collectively try to influence policy. And we all know how political parties function. We have non-government organizations that are for pursuit of a single social goal. People who believe in that goal join the non-government organization, also called NGO. We have unions, we have all kinds of organizations. All of these are called intermediaries because on many occasions, these are the institutions that interact with government. We can't all of us go in terms of fighting for environment. We have NGOs that go and negotiate and try to influence government policy on environment. Tobacco, safety, every aspect, those are intermediaries. So a well-functioning democracy must allow for the creation and well-functioning of these intermediaries. Then, we also need public communication to be efficient and be guaranteed to allow us to express our voices, communicate our voices, and even use the media in order to influence not only policymakers, but each other. We use the media to influence each other all the time. That's one of the key functions of freedom of speech. So, well-functioning system must definitely have well-functioning public communication institutions that allow us to achieve these goals of democracy. Number 4, legal rights that must be guaranteed. That requires a good judiciary and a good constitution that defines the basic rights of individuals, and also it's independent so that it can resolve disputes. It can even serve as a control mechanism over political power. We see how judicially in democracies limits certain decisions of the policymakers. And it makes judgment between when there is a dispute between even one individual versus the entire government. And of course, then you have the system of rules, settlement, and implementation. After you elect your government officials, some government officials are selected or appointed through those that we elect. Then you have a government, a huge organization. How do components of this government function? How do they interact with each other? Separation of powers. Good functioning efficiency of bureaucracy, which is all maybe one or a small layer of people at the very top are elected. The rest of them are all either career employees, civil servants, or appointed by politicians. How good they function. So you see that these are all institutions that need to work well in order to allow us to achieve those ideal goals of democracy, which are freedom, equality, and control. Any questions, comments? Before we go forward, I'd like to make a parallel between economic theory of ideal economic system and political theory of an ideal political system, because in Western political thought, they are closely connected. So the ideal, I think we've mentioned this, but I'd like you to keep this in mind as we move forward. The ideal model of economic system in capitalism is a model in which you have perfect competition. And we already said why that is important. Because in a perfectly competitive market, our preferences affect the demand, and then the producers will immediately respond to that demand by producing whatever we are willing to buy. And we said a well-functioning competitive system leads the production process to such a point, to such a scale of production, that the cost of production is minimal, and then the price is equal to that minimum cost. So 3 components. First of all, consumers are king or in charge, correct? Anything that consumer wants through the demand process is communicated, and producers are willing to produce it as long as the cost of production is covered by the price that consumers are willing to pay. And then the efficiency in production for them. What does democracy do? Democracy means the citizens express their preferences for collective action, and those preferences lead to the election of representatives that represent the will of the people. How do we know that? Because of the median voter, correct? Median voter model told us that in a well-functioning ideal democracy, which is what median voter outcome would be, anything that's elected, any decision that is made, will always represent the will of the 51% of the people at least. Correct? There is no way that the policy is approved if it doesn't enjoy the support of 50% plus one. So we are always assuring that the majority of people are interested in something that is approved. That means our preferences are always reflected in public policy. Of course, in real capitalism, we don't have perfect competition, and in real political systems, we don't have that ideal system. We have already learned about some of its defections, and in reality, many countries are not even democratic. All right, so 3 ideals and 5 key institutions. Remember, our goal is to come up with some kind of measurement and mechanism so that we can collect data on different political systems and say, this system is a full democracy, this is an effective democracy, this is something else, and so on. So when you combine them, you come up with some ideas. But before we put those together, just a little bit of explanation about these 3 ideals so that you know exactly what we are interested in. Number 1, freedom. The freedom in democratic and political systems means the transfer of individual preferences to policymakers in free and fair elections. So that's the key component. And second, political systems should allow for continuous political participation. So it's not that you elect a regime or a leader once and it's all finished and the leader can claim that we have legitimacy because 10 years ago or 20 years ago people voted for our system. It is a continuous process of election and re-election. And even between elections, the people have the right to form NGOs, to petition, and to express themselves through freedom of speech. What about equality? Now, this is something that it might have a dimension that you did not expect. And equality in political process and political system facilitates the opportunity for all citizens to participate in the relevant democratic institutions. Now, this is the right to participate. That's why we call it input egalitarianism. and comprises the fair and equal treatment of citizens by the state. The right to participate, but completely equal. All the opportunities are equal. If you can vote, then all other citizens are free to vote. If you have freedom of speech, that's for everyone. If you can run for office, run to become a president, that should be available to all citizens. However, it does not mean equality of outcome or economic equality. Okay? So it simply means input inequality. Therefore, society could be completely unequal in wealth, income, but in terms of political input, you have egalitarianism. And finally, control. It means that you have legal control over political power. Whoever has power can be checked and monitored and even held accountable by another source of power in society. President is accountable. Members of the parliament are accountable to another institution. That's why separation and balance of power is so important. There is no politician or policymaker that is unaccountable to the society. So power is concentrated, political leaders are powerful and strong, but at the same time they are accountable. There is no unaccountability in the power system. Political oversight by intermediary institutions, like political parties, associations, and NGOs. All of these not only help us express our will, but they also serve as monitors and watchdogs on behalf of society. They can expose abuse, they can call people to mobilize against a representative and say we call for the recall or removal of a person from office, and that means they play a role. And of course you have oversight and accountability by the media, very important, and by the legislature. The executive branch is subject to accountability by the legislature. The judiciary is subject to monitoring and accountability by the legislature. Okay. So if you put all of these together, then we can now create a matrix. A matrix that has 15 dimensions, meaning 3 qualities that we care about and 5 institutions that we talked about. So this is a mechanism, a criteria for evaluating different political systems. So for example, we go to the procedures for decision making and we say, what is the quality of that procedure from a freedom point of view? What is the quality of that procedure from equality point of view? What is the quality of that procedure from control point of view? So you are now trying to understand the details of how a democracy functions based on what are the ideals of a democratic system. So we have a rational, logical mechanism for assessing the quality of democracy. And then when we study one country, the country could have a strength in one cell, weakness in the other cell. So now we can identify really what are the strengths and weaknesses of a political system based on various criteria. So you don't say generally that is a dictatorship, that is a corrupt democracy. What are the specific components of that? And I have the website for you. If you go to that website, they have used these and tried to assign values to different countries. I think they go back, they have a data for many years, and the latest update, according to them, has been 2018, where they assign scores for this. And then they could use the scores to put countries in different categories. To show you what they have done, here is an example of their 2018 data, the most recent data. And here, based on those scores, and there you have the matrix of 15 cells. That is the underlying theoretical foundation for the scores that they have come up with to categorize countries in this group. And they say we divide countries into illiberal democracies, in egalitarian democracy, balanced democracy, and unaccountable democracy. So the reason they have these different names is because of those different criteria that they have introduced that allows them to identify the defect. Remember, the broad name was defective democracies. But now they say we can identify the kind of defect in a democracy so that we can have a better understanding of where different countries stand. But one thing that's interesting is that they put the United States and some other countries in Latin America into the group of inegalitarian democracies. That's the name that they come up with. But what does that mean? It means that you have a democratic system. Many aspects of democracy that we have identified are in effect, but the equality of access to political right has been below perfect. So there is weakness in the criteria for equality. In egalitarian democracy, weaknesses in the fair and equal treatment of citizens by the state. And that was, of course, the case when democracies were first introduced. What does that mean? Who were allowed to vote when the American democracy was established?
White men.
White men with property, not even
Property,
white
yeah,
men.
that's right.
You had a criteria for property. Then eventually, over time, it has changed. Blacks were granted the right to vote. The southern states who were very upset about that process said the only way we can marginalize black vote is to encourage women to, allow the women to vote. So that became an excuse for increasing the sovereignty to women as well. But in practice, still some minorities were excluded. And even today, still we get reports that there is discrimination in certain political rights, including indirect ways of preventing certain groups from voting. That's why they categorize the United States as dark blue in this category. What other groups? Illiberal democracies. That is the name that you hear often. And that's when there is weakness in the freedom criteria. So you have countries where if they say there are elections, every citizen is allowed to vote. They even monitor you, they keep track to make sure you vote, because they say that is a sign of the regime's legitimacy. So that aspect is complete in terms of equality. But citizens do not really have freedom to choose the candidates freely. And they do not have the freedom to choose the agenda on which they are voting. 2 or 3 options that the political regime approves are available to choose from. Other options are excluded, so that people cannot really exercise full political control over the policy process. That's why they are called illiberal democracy. So you see those three criteria, each one of them points out to weakness in a specific type of ideal attribute of democracy. And then what about unaccountable democracy? This is where the citizens can elect, they have freedom to elect people, or at least on some issues, they have freedom to freely express themselves and even participate, but they cannot fully hold the regime accountable. For example, the media might be restricted, or freedom of speech, or judicially might be manipulated by the political leaders so that the judiciary cannot hold the politicians accountable. That makes it a illiberal, unaccountable democracy. So this, I think, gives us a better way of categorizing non-democratic societies. And of course, you have degrees of the lack of democracy or the deprivation of democracy, between full democracy and between, and the other extreme, which is fully authoritarian. But today, in every country, there are elections, or at least there is a nominal lip service to people's participation in political process. They try to legitimize the rule by saying, yes, we adhere to this because it's universally popular. Now, if you go here, because they have collected data, and their data goes back to 1900, they can track these, the frequency of these regime types. And you can see that for countries that were considered some form of democracy, including Europe and United States, an egalitarian democracy was the dominant form, if democracy was not functioning. Keep in mind, we're talking about functioning democracy as also as a category. So over time, you see how, in terms of counting, the countries have, number of countries in each category has changed. Clearly, new countries have been established after the end of colonialism. After the breakdown of Soviet Union, for example, several new countries were created. So the total number of countries is increasing, the countries that they are studying. But the percentage is interesting, in terms of percentage of countries in each category. And you can see that balanced democracies are the ideal ones. So this has gradually increased. But over time, especially after 1970s, we are not in a transitional stage because some of the other ones are also stable and their share is not declining. You have illiberal democracies. What has happened to the share of illiberal democracies? It has not declined, it has increased. Some countries that experimented with democracy genuinely after 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they have backtracked into illiberal democracy through some kinds of practices. On the other hand, some countries have increased. One thing that has happened is that many countries have over time transitioned from inegalitarian democracies, which means democracies with discrimination. The system is very good functioning on paper, but they were not implementing it correctly. There has been a transition from these into balanced democracies. Every step, for example, in the United States to allow citizens to vote who were indirectly deprived of voting has brought the US closer to this option. And moving forward. So this is an overview of the regime types that exist around the board. You have other graphs to show you what they are and how they are functioning. There are critics of all of this mechanism, for example, by China, which has a different criteria for democracy. It emphasizes a balance between economic and political democracy. But these in-between countries, especially in liberal democracies, are very important to know about because these are the ones who have engaged in what we call state-led development, meaning that some of these countries have used their power, because they're not fully democratic. The elite, the ruling elite, have used their power to guide the economy in direction of development, in the direction that they believe is good for their societies. That's why they are called developmental states. The states that take the lead on development and sometimes use force to impose their favorite economic policies. So one goal of the government in a capitalist system is to make sure unemployment is low, inflation is low, so that the economy functions well. And then another one, which is related to regulations, is to address market failures, correct? You're all familiar with different kinds of market failures. The role of government is to correct those, but the primary duty is to make sure the market capitalism functions. And then decision on how much to invest, where to invest, which industries will be receiving more investment, which ones less, that is left to the private sector, correct? It is corporations that make investments. Government is not supposed to be a producer in the economy. It's just supposed to be the manager of the entire system to make sure it functions well. That is the role of a government in advanced functioning capitalist systems, market economies. But in many countries, the government assumes a more active role, which means that it sets objectives for economic production, it sets long-term goals in terms of direction of industry, that technology that government wants to promote, and then it uses government policy, incentives, taxes, regulations to lead the private sector in that direction, plus it itself functions as a producer. In many countries, you have very large government-owned enterprises. When a government is very active in setting the direction of economic development and being the largest participant in that process, we say that government functions as a developmental state. Okay. So the term was created because there were so many non-democratic governments in third world countries, in Africa, Latin America. And when we looked at the performance of those economies, we saw that in some of them, the government was acting as a predator. It was preying on the economy to capture resources, to capture income for the ruling elite. And then there were some others, especially in Asia, where it was not democratic, but economic growth was good, economic development was good, infrastructure was being developed. And when economists thought of a name for the behavior of these governments, they called them developmental states. Not democratic states, but The states that have concentration of power but are focused on developing the economy. So what do they like to do? An example of what they try to do is to not only make the economy grow, but transform the economy. So consider an economy as a pie. And then you have different economic sectors. You have agriculture, you have industry, and you have services. Very broad categories of economic activity. What the developmental state does is that it wants to achieve economic growth. So we can see that, for example, in this transition over time, the size of this pie is much larger. But it actively interferes in the economy, guides the economy, so that the relative share of these sectors is also different. For example, in this case, if A represents agriculture, the share of agriculture has declined from, let's say, around 48% here to 25% after that. That is a representation of how a developmental state functions. It has a blueprint on the share of different sectors. It can even create a new slice for a new sector, and it's actively allocating resources, either attracting private sector resources or using public sector resources to achieve that goal. So what are some of the examples of activities that the governments use? Regulations. Whenever necessary, they limit the market mechanism. For example, they might deliberately increase the tariff on imports of one commodity and reduce the tariff on another commodity that they want to attract, maybe it's intermediate goods, so that a certain sector in the economy is promoted. And they also restrict the flow of capital. Liberal capitalism says all governments should try to open up their markets. The capital markets should be open so that foreign investors can bring money into an economy easily, take it out, and that creates incentives for investment. Developmental states say, no, we will decide that in sector A you can invest, sector B and C is closed to you for whatever reasons, and that's how they manage to direct investment in a specific sectors. And they might even block foreign investment in a specific sector. Okay, what are the key assumptions of a developmental state? The state plays a key role in the process of economic development. What are some of the unique features of it? It provides a vision for the direction of development, identifies priority sectors, identifies level of investment in education, human capital, in which direction we have priority. Then it coordinates. One of the other functions that it has is to create coordination between the state and private sector, and also among private enterprises. Is anyone familiar with industrial policy in South Korea? So, South Korea decided that they wanted to go, let's say, into the global export market in television. What do? In the United States, of course, the US doesn't produce much television, but when it was a lot of production in the US, there was no government interference. You had a few companies competing against each other, and the government was impartial. Today, frontier technology like AI or computer chips, government does not pick winners. The government does not interfere between Apple, Intel, Palantir, or whichever group. It provides guidelines for all of them and creates a fair playground. In some countries, the government brings the members of an oligopoly, 3 or 14 companies that are producing, and says, here is a division in Ministry of Technology. We are going to coordinate among you because we want you to share technology and compete in the global market. Our goal is to have all of you successful, if necessary, to even merge some of you so that as representative of the country, you can compete globally. That's when the government regulates the private enterprises. Okay? So it is a way of saying our country is a corporation, we are competing against the rest of the world. And this policy was practiced in 1970s, 1980s in South Korea. If you have a company like Samsung or LG or some of these successful companies, it's because of this coordination among them, sharing of technology, which was facilitated by Korean government. So you have, what does that mean? That means that government has a vision that we want to go into export market for this product. And our country must go into that export market, so I'm going to pick up winners and stop others from coming in. I have selected 3 companies. These are the ones that I'm going to help succeed. Later on, we're going to learn about Japan and how Japan's Ministry of Trade and Industry, called MITI, facilitated the rapid economic and industrial development of Japan 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And that served as a role model for South Korea. Later on, South Korea and Japan served as role models for China, which is the latest country that has used the model of development of the state. Coordination. Then, preventing capital scarcity. Whenever necessary, the government itself tries to inject capital, become a partner when needed to promote certain industries. And of course, function that all governments participate in to correct market failure. What are some of the examples of successful developmental state? South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. These countries are referred to as, I think there is one more along with them, the Asian tigers. They were famous as Asian tigers. I believe it was South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Malaysia, if I'm not mistaken. If you look up Asian tigers, you would see the correct links. And later on, other countries have adopted this policy: Argentina, Brazil, Ethiopia, Rwanda in certain parts, and more recently, of course, China. So, US is an exception in which the private sector itself is so strong that it really doesn't need government support. In many countries, government is active in developing plans, guiding the economy, and acting as an active participant in all economic activities. Okay, so continuing with these characteristics of a developmental state, we said that the state, which is defined as the government, primarily a ruling political elite, very often these countries, when we look at their experience, this happens during a time when you have a powerful authoritarian leader which is backed by the military. So it has very strong absolute power. It suppresses the power of unions. It prevents wage dispute from disrupting production. And the government coerces the working class to continue to work even though their living standards are low and the wages are low. And why do they do that? Because they want to allow the corporations to be profitable, successful, and competitive. So for a while, they use non-democratic political behavior to suppress any kind of dissent or protest while they are empowering the corporations in selected technologies. So when we look at South Korea, the positive side is that government was actively supporting these corporations. But the other side of that was that government was also suppressing the labor. On one hand, labor was educated, participating, but they wanted to make the wages manageable to assure profitability. Why would they want that? Because they want the price that they charge when they export to be low, to be competitive. Low price means low profit margin, a lot of pressure on workers, non-democratic rule that allows the government to prevent worker protest or instability. So you can see the connection between developmental state and political non-democracies. That aspect of that morally might be considered failure, but these governments justify that and say we need a stability to achieve our developmental goals. And then they argue that after 2 or 3 decades, when the economy improves, wages rise, they say our economic success is the source of our leadership's legitimacy. We are not legitimate because of electoral process, where people elect the leaders. We are legitimate because we have successfully brought economic development and prosperity. Prosperity becomes the source of legitimacy in many of these governments. Okay. Coordination to overcome market failure, we already talked about that. Transition, deliberately suppressing some sectors, allowing some sectors to fail, and promoting others, transition from agricultural to modern industrial sectors. Another important thing they do, they coordinate the banking and financial sector. They direct the financial sector to provide credit to specific sectors, because after all, industrial success requires financial resources. In the United States, those resources come from market. Banking system does cost-benefit evaluation. In these countries, often the government directs the banks to provide credit at low interest rate to certain sectors. That was certainly the case in Japan, for example, for many years. They would select the specific sectors in certain periods of time. Automobiles, 1960s. Advanced electronics, 1970s. So once they select something, they bring the industry leaders, but they also provide them with financial resources. How do they do that? They don't allow the banks to just lend based on market interest rate. They say 50% of your money must go to this industry, the other 50% you're welcome to charge interest and give it to consumers, give it to whoever wants to buy a house. But first we take the share of our priority target industry. It's not a democratic system. You can't do that in the United States because they go to file a lawsuit and they prevent the government from doing that. But when you are a development state, you can do it. Of course, you can do it in the US as long as you take the issue to the Congress and get approval for it, then it becomes a law, but generally that is not. Acquisition of technology. That means the government itself has units with very well-educated groups of engineers, scientists, engaged in developing new technologies because they believe the private sector might not be strong enough. But the intelligence service of the country is also used for industrial espionage. You see these movies about CIA or other intelligence services, all these people who go kill each other, and you enjoy watching people do that. But the important aspect of their activities is industrial espionage on behalf of domestic corporations, and all countries, unfortunately, engage in this. Developmental states, they transfer technology, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. They develop technology, so they are actively participating in promoting technological advancement. Okay. Obviously, one aspect of that is the educational policy. Again, educational policy is fully coordinated so that it represents the future labor, human capital need of the society. One country that has been very successful in developing educational policy is Singapore. So Singapore has a commission that is in touch with the private sector. They have continuous meetings. And they sit and plan the human labor needs of the next 20 years. We need this many engineers in this field. We need this many people in banking. And then they communicate that to universities. In Singapore, university degrees, the number of admissions is regulated. It's not simply based on market interest or student interest. They decide these are the fields that we need in the future, so let's encourage people to go in these directions. So there's active educational policy. All right. Then you also have a state ownership of firms and assets, which varies from country to country. In most countries, the state-owned enterprises are not as efficient as you expect. And that has resulted in privatization. Because they support these public enterprises, then they realize that they are losing money, therefore they privatize them. In some countries, public enterprises are competitive. In China, for example, some of the very successful enterprises in terms of technological innovation are government-owned, yet they function very well. Or they are partially government-owned. For example, Huawei is not a private firm. It is partially private, but functioning very well. Developmental states encourage private end ownership, but expects the private sector to be subordinate. So this subordination is also a key factor. All sectors are subordinate to government's guidelines. What makes them developmental state is that the government has a benevolent objective. It's not trying to extract resources. So the industries understand that they're subordinate for a national objective, success in national level. They're subordinate to the guidelines and interventions of the state. So for example, China has transitioned from a communist regime to a system that we call now a state-led capitalism. So the latest one, the most significant model of development of the state now is China, where it was the communist regime up until 1980, with more than 90% of production belonging to the government, but they transitioned into private sector in a stage by stage, and we are going to learn about that later. Stage by stage, they transitioned into a system where you have now a viable, active private sector and functioning next to a public sector. The process in the past 40 years has had many aspects of a developmental state. All of these attributes that we described, China has practiced them. But, and the concept of developmental state is not a new concept. Many countries in different stages of their development have experienced this process, meaning that the countries that today advocate for free market enterprise and government non-intervention, when you look back at their past history, countries like Great Britain, the United States, France, Germany, each one of them in certain stage in their history behaved as developmental state. The government was actively interfering in the economy, it was protecting industries, it was providing guidelines for industries. But they gradually transitioned into mature capitalist economies, and of course other nations have adopted these policies in order to be competitive in global economy. Okay, so here are some examples, historical examples, which go way back. So this is, maybe these are like classic ancient examples. Britain, under Henry VII, import substitution industrialization was actively practiced, which means that there were imports of skilled labor for certain industries. To protect domestic industry, import duties were imposed. Some raw material was limited to domestic consumption, exports were banned, so that it would be affordable for domestic industry. I guess because it's raw wool, it must have been for textile. And then other examples, policies that they did, Great Britain at certain period in the 16th century developed a superior navy which was primarily used to support international trade. It was a navy in support of promoting exports, using force to open up markets of other economies to Great Britain's products. So it was part of the government support for domestic economy. As you can see, example is that it was used to prevent the merchants of other countries from trading in British ports, so that those ports can primarily benefit the British economy. Maybe you are familiar with the history of New York and how English became the dominant language in New York, because if I'm not mistaken, New York was a port that had a very heavy Dutch presence. And then the British Navy, one day, the Navy commander entered the port and said that from now on all communications are in English, and this is because this is an English colony. No more Dutch language and restrictions on other aspects of Dutch. And other examples of this. So you can see that this is just an evidence of how these industrial developmental state policies are not new concepts, but they are implemented in a new fashion after 1960s in many Asian countries and Latin American countries.